From the Post Building in downtown North St. Louis, this is Inside City.
So here we are. Here we are with Martin Goebel, friend, designer, one of the most amazing creative people that I've met here in St. Louis. That I have the honor to be his friend. We've met since 2012 in Design Week, I believe. And for the people that is watching the Inside City, today we are starting a new lane with emerging brands. And I want to bring Martin Goebel and Goebel Furniture and Kindred. Martin has been, if you've been in this, probably a lot of bars in St. Louis, you've been sitting in one of Martin seats and, bars. He has done a bunch of work for a lot of different hospitality and also corporate spaces, Clayco, Nike, Philly Stark. I mean, there's a lot to say about Goebel Furniture. So tell us a little bit about you, your story. How do you, how was your comeback to St. Louis once you left for college? And just let's talk about Goebel Furniture.
Great, thank you so much, Carlos. Really pleased to be here, pleased to be in St. Louis. And I've now run Goebel & Company Furniture here in St. Louis for the last 14 years as of February 6th. So as of 2011, I came back to St. Louis after graduate school at Rhode Island School of Design in Providence.
So when I met you, you were right out of school back to St. Louis.
I had just gotten to St. Louis about a year and a half earlier. And then we were dealing with a lot of issues with the recession at that point, an economic downturn and all of that. So in terms of my education and my background within luxury goods, product development, there were quite frankly just no jobs. So I was working previously part-time on contract for a Mexican onyx company developing lighting and things like that. And then previous to that was working on contract for a furniture company in Maine. And it was very clear that there was no future in any of those jobs, and they were short term. They weren't very good money. And I thought to myself, if I have a boss I don't enjoy and bad money in a place I don't like living, I can do that for myself.
And then you came home.
I came home, yes. And I'd been in and out of St. Louis many times over. I did some original education right out of high school in central Michigan, Grand Rapids. But I came back for a little bit to try to figure out what I wanted to do, as that wasn't the right path. I went to Northern California and I did a traditional craftsmanship apprenticeship in furniture making. And then I came back to St. Louis. I built custom furniture for a little bit and didn't really have a greater skill set. One of the biggest problems with having a really great skill set is you become very limited and single-minded toward that. And so making good furniture, making sound decisions with regard to how things are made, that was no problem. But any sort of design, any sort of business acumen, any of that just wasn't in the skill set at that point. So at one point I got really, really angry with furniture, just wasn't having a lot of success with that. And I actually went back to Mizzou for journalism for a number of years.
Oh, kidding.
And
interesting.
Of course, the minute I got to Mizzou for journalism, I found myself driving back to St. Louis 3 days a week to build furniture because, of course, the minute I got there, the commissions now started rolling in.
It's hard for me to believe that you walked away from furniture. It's such a passion of yours.
It's as simple as I didn't want to be a woodworking or furniture monk. I didn't want to sacrifice every other last thing in my life in order to do this one singular path. Mm-hmm. And in hindsight, I have to laugh because I've somewhat done that now, but it's the kind of thing in which, I like to ski, I like to scuba dive, I like to eat, I like to drink, I like to do all of these things. And when you're 21 years old and you're watching all of your friends play collegiate sports and, go to these lovely vacations over spring break, and now you're sitting in a 2-car garage working on furniture alone, it's a sobering thing. And you try to figure out what path is going to, number one, make you happy, because after 6 months of isolation in that, you can make all the nice furniture you want. But if you're not happy, you're not going to continue that.
Right.
So it really was important for me to leave it for a while. And then the market told me that I should come back to it because now I was well out of my parents' funding at that point for college. So I still needed to make money. And so I was driving back to St. Louis 3 days a week to build furniture out of my shop. And then I was at Mizzou 4 days a week for journalism.
So you had a shop when we met. You had a shop at Midtown Alley, and you were part of that movement of bringing back Midtown Alley with a bunch of creatives there. So how was your shop is now bigger, better. You're doing bigger things, but how tell us a little bit about those days. How was the flavor of those days? Those first contracts that you were working on.
So we originally had a 1,800 square foot shop down in the Patch neighborhood by Carondelet here in St. Louis, right next to Perennial Artisan Ales. And Perennial Artisan Ales, as well as Urban Chestnut Brewery, as well as Four Hands Brewery, were all emerging in those years right after the recession. Some of that was as a result of Budweiser being then sold to InBev.
Right.
And a lot of people then within the brewing industry, the marketing industry, all of that, were now looking for new paths of revenue streams. And so that time when we moved to Midtown Alley, about 2013-ish, was a really unique time in St. Louis because you had all of these really great creatives that were coming out of mass industry. If I'm not mistaken, you were at Express Scripts at that time, right?
Well, that was before. I was at Kiko Bara, when we met, I was at the AIGA serving at the board of AIGA.
Okay.
And in Design Week, and it was interesting because what you're saying is really connecting with. There are so many phases in St. Louis of like renewal. Like I think after the recession of 2008, all those chefs that came to open restaurants that end up hiring you for furniture, so people start to reconnect with what they knew, and kind of like a new wave of creatives came, right? With producing things, making things.
Well, if you think of restaurants, there was a major shift, especially here in St. Louis in those years, because you had any number of chefs and talented individuals that then went to the coasts, and they figured out that now they had failing restaurants with regard to where they were working, or they had skill sets that they developed in these other larger markets. But if you're in San Francisco, if you're in Brooklyn, if you're in South Boston, to start a restaurant, to start a furniture business, to start a branding agency, it's just not possible in the way it's possible in St. Louis because of the just cheaper cost of living, cost of starting.
There's also something about the resource. People are really resourceful here and scrappy. People create and make things do, and they just thrive. I mean, I'm not from St. Louis, so I see that like in other cities, there is a different ability. I think the whole makers movement here is really hard. It's really strong.
Well, St. Louis over the last, say, 150 years has bounced in and out of being a legacy city and a destination city. And depending on the 25 years, one way or the other, people are either coming here in droves or they're leaving in droves.
Interesting.
And I think recently there's been some very, very bad press and quite frankly, some bad action with regard to crime in St. Louis.
Right.
And that's very negatively affecting the number of people and perception of the city. And it's been something that I think has been one of the biggest debilitating factors toward the growth of St. Louis in the last, I guess 40 years.
But the reality is that entrepreneurs like you, they thrive. They find their way. They kind of like reconnect with family, with friends from maybe high school, or and somehow things happen. I mean, you've been blessed with a lot of interesting projects. With Clayco, with Washu. You have all those. Let's talk about those projects. How do you get there, and how for the younger entrepreneurs that are building their own brands, just let's give them some of the insights about how was your breakthrough, and how you follow.
Well, the biggest thing for me was just getting back to St. Louis and telling everybody I absolutely ever met in my life, this is what I'm doing. Very much self-promotion. You need to believe it yourself. If you don't believe it yourself, nobody else is going to. And my first really large commercial project was actually the Urban Chestnut Brewery on Manchester Road. And they bought about 70 pieces of furniture from us in probably 2013, 14, something like that. And it was our first foray into commercial furniture which brought a lot more money, brought volume, brought my ability to bring in more people, more equipment. And it was a great case study in which I could then go and market off of from there. And because St. Louis loves buying from St. Louis people,
Right.
It not only started that off for us, but it then validated us with regard to a lot of other people. And if you now get furniture into a commercial environment, no place is harder on furniture than a brewery or a bar.
Right.
Think of somebody buying a rental car and only driving it after midnight while drunk. That's essentially what they're doing with my furniture. And yet now 10 years later, it's still endured. But now we talk about brands, we talk about legacy of St. Louis. There's a number of places in St. Louis in which I think those of us who spend time in the city have had these iconic moments. Think of the bar stools at McGurk's right up against where the Irish band plays. If you have ever been to Soulard, there's maybe 6, 7 bar stools in all of Soulard, and they're all right there. And that's where you want to be on the night in which it's so packed to the gills. Everyone else is standing elbow to elbow. But now you have the captive audience of the bartenders. You have a great view of everything. And Urban Chestnut was kind of an interesting one for us because now after 10 years, those tables are just starting to become those destination places because now they can accommodate large groups of people. You can bring your own food. Quite frankly, your dog can sleep under them. You might have met your girlfriend there, but there's so much of what we do with regard to legacy and personal significance, whereas I'm not trying to create experience. I'm trying to create a vessel in which experience can create in, around, and to it. So the value really does not come from the quality of the product or the design of the product.
It's enabling the experience.
It's enabling the experience, right. And
right.
In a city that has such a reverence for itself and for the little inner sanctum experiences you have there, the same reason that if you're from Kirkwood, you generally stay in Kirkwood for dinner, you don't go to Webster Groves.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we stay in our own bubbles. Probably I only go to Brennan's. But what is interesting is that sometimes this is what I love about paying attention to the nuance of the makery of things.
Sure.
When you go to a bar, you sit on a stool in a specific corner, in a specific angle, on a specific height. So I think it's kind of interesting to show people, put in the face of the one who makes those decisions, which is in your case. How many bars have you done? What other bars have you done sitting and bars,
Our furniture is represented in probably 50 or 60 different public spaces in St. Louis. The restaurants kind of come in and out, and a lot of the restaurant groups even will use the furniture in one concept. It'll work for 3 or 4 years, and then they'll put the furniture into storage and you see it reemerge, or they'll sell it to yet a different furniture group. And now the furniture that we did for, say, the Companion Bakery in Clayton, that it hasn't been there in God knows how many years, probably 8, 9 years. It's reemerged in other locations.
That's funny.
And it's sold to then different restaurant groups or, just different experiences, but it's a different experience in each location. But when you think of furniture or experience, I can tailor that experience like you tailor a suit. So if you want it to look a certain way, you want it to feel a certain way, you want it to move a certain way, you can do all of that. If it's going to be a single experience, or if I want you to be at a bar for 30 minutes, I want you to have 2 drinks in 30 minutes, I can make sure the bar stool will keep you there no longer.
Wow, that's interesting.
If now all of a sudden you're going to interact with a group of 6, how can I keep you there as long as humanly possible? We can tailor furniture to now do that. It's about proximity. It's about height. It's about the ability to move around it, because every seat in a restaurant is what would be considered productive furniture or square footage. So in terms of furniture and design for hospitality spaces, generally the chairs that go into restaurants are 1 square foot smaller than what would go into your house, because it's all about productive hours in that time. So if you can do an extra seating of furniture, if I can have someone drink 3 drinks and leave, as opposed to drink 3 drinks in 30 minutes or an hour and then have 1 more, they're going to nurse it for the next hour. You make less money. So if we can tailor those experiences and make sure that we're making the furniture as productive as possible, make it able not to be, make it so it can withstand what occurs to it.
Right.
You can't be shocked when people knock over bar stools.
No, absolutely.
It's what happens.
But you also shifted now to home goods. So you have. Let's talk about Kindred and your new brand for these heirloom pieces that will withstand. Once you buy one of those tables, they will stay with your family forever.
So we originally started in residential furniture, and then we quickly made the jump to commercial furniture because the money was better. The numbers were higher, right? And we still do a lot of very high-end bespoke furniture, but in terms of a dining table at $20,000, $30,000, quite frankly, it's a big market. It's a very big market, but it's not the lifestyle that I've ever led. Even if I could spend $20,000 or $30,000 on a dining table, I wouldn't, because I don't think you need to, and it's not where I feel comfortable. And it bothered me during the pandemic that now there was this mass group of people that was buying furniture because everyone was in their homes again. They finally took a look around and said, you know what, I'm not going to go to Hawaii this year. I'm going to spend $3,000, $4,000 on Wayfair.com, and I'm going to revamp this space, or I'm going to now work from home. So I want to feel comfortable here. And I had nothing to sell them. And that drove me nuts because I had all of these good people that made good money. And now the barrier to entry to my products was $20,000. That's insanity.
So what do you do?
Well, so it's mainly a volume game. If I'm handcrafting one-of-a-kinds out of exotic hardwoods from around the world, there's a cost associated with that. It's not just a matter of I want 20 grand and I'm greedy. But it's the fact that now, to make the residential furniture available to the masses, I need to do higher volumes. So instead of now it all going to Nike's corporate offices or Philippe Stark hotels in Europe or Tommy Bahama's corporate headquarters in New York, we would do this mass volume of furniture in batches and with automation, but with the same handcrafted methodology.
Right.
So we're building it in the exact same way that if you took a craftsman, say from the court of Henry VIII, and you brought him into our shop, aside from the fact from electric motors, he'd understand what we're doing. It's wood, it's glue, it's a little bit of finish. If you think of like artisan bread versus Wonder Bread, you read the back of Wonder Bread, there's like 30 ingredients, all sorts of stabilizers and all sorts of other crap in there to make it not mold and whatnot. But if you look at artisan bread, it's very basic, elemental. You don't need all of that. But what we're doing is taking that same artisan product, utilizing digital design, automated technology, and producing it about 95% by robot, by machine. And then the last 5% is by hand, which is really what you see.
Right.
But not only for efficiency, but also for the integrity of it. It is so ridiculous that in the US, people assume that high precision made products by machine are worse than grandpa in his back garage knocking it together with an old rusty chisel and a little bit of, linseed oil mixed with Jack Daniels. It's ridiculous. I mean, but that's the assumption.
The perception, right.
And I think that's because over the years, people have used technology in a very bad way to make things cheaper, faster, and planned obsolescence, 7 years, in and out, washers, dryers, cars, furniture, engineered to fail, 7 years.
That's, you mentioned the grandpa, knocking things out of the garage. I always was fascinated by the story of your grandfather that was an immigrant, a German immigrant.
So I've got that grandfather was an Austrian immigrant.
Austrian,
and the other side of the family was German immigrants. So.
Okay, and he ended up becoming the pastry chef.
Yes, so he was what was called a Konditorei, or he had his German masters, European masters in pastry. And he was from Vienna. And then he came here to the United States on a 6-month visa to work with the Chase Park Plaza Hotel. And he ended up staying for 40 years before he then passed away.
That's I always found that a very fascinating story because in a way, I'm personally shaped by the craftsmanship of my grandfathers too. And I wonder if there's a correlation there. Like you end up in such a, you pay so much attention to detail. You know, we've been together in bars and you're analyzing the furniture, how bad it is, or how, you know, what things are not working versus the ones that you do. So you feel like, you know, there's some influence that, you know, how do you talk to me about your family? Your father was also an architect, you know, how
Yes.
that shaped you in a way.
Well, I think there's definitely a nurture and a nature side of what we all end up doing. And you have a predisposition to certain things, but I don't necessarily know if that was because of the grandfather or because of the father who was the architect, or it was just what we grew up around. You
Hmm.
know, my grandfather, when I was a kid, I grew up in Richmond Heights. And for birthdays, he would bring a mountain, literally, you know, sort of like kind of looked like a Christmas tree of cream puffs.
Oh,
And then he would
right.
take, I know where they would bake like a little puff and then, you know, fill them with cream. And then they would end up taking spun sugar and he'd whip it over the top. So you would have almost like a tinsel kind of look. So
Okay.
it kind of looked like a Christmas tree of these little pastries, and you just take
Hmm.
bites of them. Or he'd bring home baked rolls that were still warm from the chase, because we were just, you know, down Highway 40 from the chase. So, you know, there was things like that. Whereas if you try to go from things like that, that's just what we knew. I didn't know
Right.
it was different. It
Yeah,
was
but I
just
think
the
there was an attention
reality.
to form in a way, the shape of things. You know, I'm always fascinated by how designers end up doing what they do and how they create the way they create. So, you know, the fact that, you went to design school in Long Island,
Yeah.
you came back now, you're teaching in WashU,
Yes.
so do you have a respect? And I think that's a key of success, you have a respect to the craftsmanship and design as the art of making good things.
You know, I think that at very young ages, you soak up a lot more than what you might know on the surface or what others might know. I always joke that I probably learned more about design from the Jetsons and the Flintstones, you know, just
Yeah, actually,
because
those were cool. Those.
you know, they were the Jetsons was only run for like a season and a half in like the 1960s,
Yeah,
and then
we
it
got
played
those
on
in Cuba.
reruns into the
They
80s.
were called the Supersonicos in Spanish.
Yeah. But I mean, if you look back at just what was drawn in these very basic cartoons, uh, maybe that imprinted. I mean, that's probably a little bit grandiose, but no, I don't think it was that. You know, I had friends whose parents were in the banking industry, and I remember going to their homes and they'd talk about stocks. And you know, for their
Right,
birthdays, they'd give them PepsiCo
right.
stocks, and they give them Hasbro, you know, the toy company stock and things like that. And I was like, I don't know what the hell that means. Like, you're 8 and you're getting stock, and it's like, you know, not much, but you know, when I would get home, my father would talk about buildings being built. And at the time, he was working mainly with educational buildings, so we'd go and walk through new high schools that he had done. And his one of his projects was the Lincoln Presidential Library up in Springfield, Illinois. So we walked through that on the opening day, and it's just what you're exposed to.
Right,
But you know, I've got a brother that was in the Air Force who's now a internal auditor with Centene. I've got another one that's
right.
an aviation engineer,
It
and
doesn't affect
they're
everyone.
in no way interested in the creative side of the world. Uh, I'm probably more the outlier than not.
Right.
So I think it's just what you like, and very much like the furniture. My parents were creating a situation in which now experience could occur that we were driving, as opposed to them saying you're going to be an architect or you're going to be an engineer or anything like that. So, but there was definitely things throughout the childhood that I experienced that have left a profound impression upon me, that have now brought me back to St. Louis. And then I operate within, I guess, my own set of,
Mhm.
I don't want to call them rules, but I think all of us as creatives have a framework in which we work within, and it's their own personal ideals, I think.
Mhm.
And I don't do certain things because it's against that ethos that, you know, makes me unique or makes my offerings mine.
Well, but I think, that's all about identity. I think
Sure.
all of those components inform what we make and how we do things. You're now also a father and also an adjunct professor at WashU. How do you find the time to balance it all? The WashU thing is a kind of like a new thing. So
Yeah.
tell me about what you're teaching and how are you giving back to the design community?
Well, so I have this very odd skill set, in which case I have a very traditional craft training, but then I also have a very significant training in digital design, automated manufacturing, product development, things like that. And that's a very odd little mix of skill sets. And I always wanted to have the initial training because I think it informs your choices for better products. And I can't tell you how many construction uh, individuals, actually guys swinging a hammer or construction managers that just hate the architects because they have no idea how things are made.
Right.
And I'd never wanted to be that person. And so, in terms of now what I'm doing at the Washington University School of Architecture, I'm not an architect. There's plenty of architectural professors there. There's plenty of structural engineers that are at close at hand. But working people through the realities of digital design and how that can apply to the real world is pretty important, because as a designer of consumer products, you dictate how people live life. So, as I was mentioning earlier about restaurants, based on the height, the proximity, do I want you to stay there longer? Can I make a more angular chair? I can dictate how long you're going to sit there. And I think it's really important for those making those decisions to know how to manipulate each one of those little, I guess, factors to it. Scientific method. So if someone said to me, Martin, look at a branding of your company and tell me about all the factors and, how do I adjust those to now convey a certain message? I look at them like they had three heads because I don't have an expertise in that.
Right.
Or if I talk to my grandfather about how to manipulate the sweetness of a souffle cheesecake, I just assume add or subtract a little bit of sugar. But weights, measures, balances, I can do that with furniture. You can do that with branding. He could do that with pastry. But in terms of now my contributions to students, I wanted to give them the skill set that would then allow them to do that as they go into future design endeavors, because that's how we make better products. That's how we make better design choices, by understanding, that this virtual sheet of paper in a computer actually needs to come out, and some poor bastard's got to use it at one point.
Yeah. The decision-making process is, there's a lot about anticipation. You have to anticipate how usage is going to inform, behavior, basically. So I think your students might be having a good time getting to know those, insights on how to make things. So how about family life? How is that going with your little kid? And, how does, does that inspire you? How is that drives you crazy? Is the kid sleeping? What's going on?
Right. Well, so I actually started designing a crib for my daughter.
I saw that
about a year ago.
That's beautiful.
And so daughter's about 4 months old right now. So it's about time to get that crib going. But I agonized over that. If it was a client, design it in 3 days, get it into production.
Right.
6 weeks later, they've got the most beautiful crib they've ever seen. The worst problem I think a designer can have is every tool or every crayon in the box. Give me 5 crayons.
Limitations. Give me limitations.
Give me limitations. But in terms of that, being a father has been fabulous. She's just a sweetheart, and it grounds you in a certain way that I've always heard about. But as a single guy, as a childless husband, you don't think about it because you just have other things, and it's not a better or worse. It's not part of your experience. But I find that the time in the morning is limited and the time in the evening is limited, but it's a matter of maximizing that quality time and having this calm and this presence of mind, which then allows me to walk out the door and put my foot on the gas. And for better or worse,
Right.
I've always been very good at compartmentalizing. So when I'm home, I'm 100% home and I don't think about the rest.
Right.
And when I'm at Washington University, I don't think about Goebel and Company Furniture or Kindred. And as if I needed yet another tier of things, I've taken a senior designer position with a company called Rochdale Spears in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam. And I'm sending intellectual property to them.
Right.
And they are one of the world's largest manufacturers of furniture for big box stores.
Yeah, that's one of the things that are so peculiar about St. Louis. People just don't know how much it goes in here and how well connected you can be to the rest of the world. One of the things that I admire about your work is the sense of permanence. The solidity of the furniture, your ethos as a creative and as a business person, and I've seen your growth, as you've seen mine as well. But I think it's a beautiful thing to see how you are making St. Louis a more permanent place. And yes, from here you can branch out, and later I know about the whole Vietnam deal thing.
Sure.
And then one day you were in Vietnam, the other day you were in Zambia with the queen of a tribe doing a throne for her.
Yes.
So those were really, that's the adventurous Martin type of interesting things. Just talk about those two experiences, the one in Africa and the one in Vietnam.
There's so much about the course of action and any creative or any practitioner in which it needs to constantly evolve, but then also the simple act of any of the jobs, the furniture making, the branding, the cooking, the whatever it may be. If you do it long enough, even near perfect results are a muscle memory, a reaction.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And not just a single end result. It's not one piece of furniture I know really well. It's the skill set you can apply at anything. But in the case of Zambia, we created a throne for a woman named the High Chieftainess Melambika of the Lamba. And the Lamba tribe is from northern Zambia. And they're not the largest tribe in Zambia, but they do hold the majority of the mineral reserves. So a lot of copper mining that occurs up there, a number of other little things that they do that have made them very powerful within the country. And they were then having some wind energy created there. And then she needed a throne to then put in the back of her Range Rover and drive around to the various villages. And then through a number of other contacts, we were put in contact with her, and I had 6 weeks to now not only develop a throne, but then get it to Zambia and have her sitting in it. And if you come and buy a dining table from me, our $20,000 dining table we were talking about, a few minutes ago, we're looking at about 12 to 15 weeks of product development, material procurement, fabrication, delivery, all of that. So in the case of this, it's not the question of can we make this throne? Can I carve it elegantly? Can we inlay it with Zambian copper? Can I tailor it to her? She was 315 pounds and 5'3". She was not the standard. Oh, and she has to sit higher than everybody. So in order
there were some requests.
There was some requests, but then also we're going to assume colonial Europe was not good to Africa. And so the problem with our perception of a throne is that now generally Disney and the Habsburg Empire and any number of other European influences would form our vision of what a throne is. But now if I create a throne that looks like that to then go back to a country that's only been independent from Britain for 50 years.
Wow.
There could be some cultural things that I really miss out on there.
So you had to do all the research and get into that.
I had to do research, but really it was more research about what I shouldn't do as opposed to what I should do. And at that, there was then only a limited amount of interaction with her. Within her country, it's illegal to touch her unless she touches you. So there's some things there. I couldn't get a tape measure and just have at it. So needed to build prototypes, needed to tailor it to her to now make sure she looked in proportion, give her a footrest. It was significant. And now that's compressed into essentially a 4-week production time because you had a week of design, a week of then packing it, getting it over there, assembling it in Zambia, because I didn't have time to actually ship it. So I think one of the most successful things that we've ever done is that project, and not because of the project, but because of the constraints and the time that were then put on it.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it was as simple as making sure you had $10,000 or $15,000. So when the throne was pulled off the plane in Ghana, I could go and bribe the baggage handler to put it back on.
Dang.
And if I hadn't done that, this entire process would be a totally moot point.
So you hand delivered the throne. You weren't there with her.
So I ended up putting the throne on the plane March 5th of 2020. And I had 2 weeks in which I was going to be in Zambia. I had to assemble it in a hotel room, which was apparently the only safe place, because if a white guy shows up in Zambia from the United States in this rural area, red flags go up, especially with a bunch of crates that are marked with the royal name. So I ended up there and was doing all of this, and simultaneously, if you recall, in 2020, that's right when the pandemic hit. So I was supposed to be there 2 weeks. I ended up there 5 weeks because I couldn't get a flight out. I had to fly from Zambia to South Africa to Abu Dhabi, which is definitely not on the way to the United States, and then eventually back through Dulles. And that was 5 weeks after I left.
Dang.
So, there was some challenges, and only one very small part of that was the actual furniture making. But it puts you in these situations,
right,
which are night and day. We've done this with.
You have done this before. Like you travel to deliver your own furniture.
We've done this with bar stools for hotels in Switzerland for Philippe Starck, who was. I've been told that meeting him is a cross between LeBron James and Kim Jong-un. We then also had a contract with a olive oil company in Greece, in which then we went out into Sparta, Greece. We marked a number of their trees for harvest based on then drought resistance, that they needed to now replant trees, and now we were going to do product out of that. And then I started working with a Vietnamese firm that actually is based in Vancouver called Redux Wood. And that brought me to Vietnam about 5 years ago for the first time. And that has now evolved as I've met a number of the manufacturing individuals in Vietnam. And there's a very big misconception about offshore manufacturing, that it's low quality. They can produce anything that we can here in the US.
Design.
It's your design. You dictate if they can do it for $80 or $800. And they're entrepreneurs just like any of the rest of us. They're going to say yes to the work.
Right.
But if you now drop their cost into 1/10, they're going to give you Scotch tape and bubble gum putting it together, as opposed to true joinery. So I was amazed at what is being done over there. And one of the things that I always wanted to do is affect the largest number of people positively. And with the way American, manufacturing subsidies work and limitations that we have here in the US, and lack of infrastructure and any number of other factors, it was going to be a very long uphill battle, which I'm 100% in for. But the ability to now affect a larger number of people faster and positively is now my interest in working with this company in Vietnam, because I can get tens of thousands of products made quickly, in which case I'm only acting as the designer, as opposed to now having to do all of it. I don't need to do the marketing. I don't need to do the sales. I don't need to do the supply chain. It is purely me saying, this is how we incrementally move people toward better design, better lifestyle. And if you can't move people 30% better immediately. It's uncomfortable. In terms of mass design, you're moving people incrementally closer. Think of like couture fashion.
Right.
What's on the runway in New York isn't what is going to be worn in St.
But
Louis or even New York.
It will inform decision making.
How we incrementally get to better, or the next stage of it. I don't know if it's better or not, but I think so.
No, good. So tell us something about the future. What's coming? What's in your development for Kindred? And the new line of business you have with that.
Well, in the immediate future, the really interesting thing that I'm working on right now through this adjunct faculty at WashU is what's called WAM manufacturing,
Okay.
wire arc additive manufacturing. And it is the 3D printing of metal. And we are running a class. My co-teacher, Hongxi Yin, and I are running a class which is called urban mining. And it's taking the existing infrastructure and built environment, so buildings in the U.S., and not demolishing, but deconstructing, and then repurposing those materials. So if you go to Asia, you go to Europe, they haven't built with virgin forest or virgin timber in probably a few thousand years.
So they take the elements from the buildings and then reuse them.
Yes, because the quality of American building, especially here in St. Louis, is amazing.
Absolutely.
Up until 1950, they were still using virgin growth forests, 500, 600, 700 year, southern yellow pine, Douglas fir trees, to build almost all of Washington Avenue.
Mm-hmm.
And those buildings, as opposed to just knocking them over, can be harvested for the materials, repurposed, and you have a significantly better product. Now, currently, repurposed materials like that are not able to be certified to be used in new construction. But in terms of Washington University, and any university for that matter, this is where the entire process and research starts. So it's twofold or two-pronged. It's not only the reuse of existing materials, but then it's also changing the way we think about construction. Whereas in the United States, construction hasn't changed much since World War II. Mm-hmm. Incrementally in certain places, but the vast majority of houses are still built just as they would have in 1950. Whereas now we're utilizing a lot of this technology, which all originates in aerospace and in medical. And shockingly, St. Louis has a little bit of that.
Right.
But using what we know with 3D design, product development, to now develop new connections for basic materials to merge with high tech, to now build faster, build cheaper, build more structurally sound.
And repurpose things that can still have a, life.
So, kind of playing on both sides of that, but we're trying to get our students now to rethink about how the built environment is created. Because those who have been in the industry too long don't have that fresh look at it because they're predisposed to other methods. Whereas we want people to look at what's possible through the technology side of it and the repurposing side of it before they look at the actual built side of it, as opposed to the built side of it and now shoehorning the other things into it.
Got it.
So it's just a new language of what we're creating there. And the success of it will be based on, what students come up with and then how it's implemented. And so the implementation is actually going to be for the Chicago Biennial, which is a big design fair in Chicago that lasts from essentially fall of 2025 to somewhere in the middle of 26. And so we're going to build a pavilion up there. And there's been some nice interaction with Clayco Construction and a few other fabulous organizations that are adding in structural engineering, materials, any number of other things that are going to support this effort. But really, it's the infancy of what Hongxi and I are looking to do with regard to creating a fabrication lab at WashU, which is now bringing in emerging technology for the built environment. And so when you think of, WashU just bought Fontbonne University, and you think of the ability for engineering students, medical students, computer science students to have not only space to build these things, but high-tech equipment that is cutting edge, where now they can take the same theories that we're using for the built environment and these connections and apply that to their genres. So it's going to be a very interesting process, and it's happening already with regard to various other universities, and we'll see what happens. But I think the success of our project is going to shed a lot of light on what's possible.
That's beautiful. Well, thank you so much for coming today to Inside City. and stay tuned for more. And for the people who are following go to goebelfurniture.com and take a look at, all the fabulous work that Martin has done over the years. Thank you so much, Martin.
Thank you. Appreciate it.